Welcome everyone to this week's AIHM Wellness Webinar. Just like to welcome everyone back. We've had a little bit of a break and just really great to see everyone, kind of letting people join the meeting now and jump into the Zoom. We're really thrilled today to be working with one of our close partners and sponsors, Southern California University of Health Sciences, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Dan Handley on what is a genetic counselor and why would I need one. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine is a global interprofessional integrative health association working to transform healthcare, body, mind, spirit, community, and planet. And today I'd like to welcome our special guest, Dr. Handley. Dr. Handley attended Johns Hopkins University, Carnegie Mellon University, and earned his Ph.D. in Human Genetics from the University of Pittsburgh. He is the director of the Clinical and Translational Genome Research Institute, the director of the Master of Science in Human Genetics and Genomics degree program at the Southern California University of Health Sciences in Southern California, and he serves on the board of directors of the Predictive Oncology. So it's really my pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Handley, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'll start my share screen now. Okay, can everyone see that?
Looks great.
Great, so today I'll be talking about, this is the first in a series of 3 separate webinars. What is a genetic counselor and why would I need one? And as previously mentioned, and I'll go to the next slide, a little bit more about me. Okay, so I'm a professor of genomics at SCU, as mentioned before, director of the Clinical and Translational Genome Research Institute, program director of the MS in Human Genetics and Genomics program. I was a former senior researcher at the UCLA School of Medicine, founding technology innovator at National Genetics Institute, former senior researcher at Procter Gamble. So I have a pretty broad background, and as mentioned before, Ph.D. in Human Genetics from the University of Pittsburgh, a Master's in Logic and Computation from Carnegie Mellon University, a BA in Biophysics from Johns Hopkins. I'm on the editorial board of 2 publications, Life Research and Clinical and Translational Sciences. And I'm obligated to disclose that I'm a member of the board of directors of a company, Predictive Oncology, which is listed on NASDAQ. So it's a little bit about me. The agenda for the webinar is I'd like to explain about the Genomics Revolution and give you some detail about that. Genomics is really exploding in pretty much every area of medicine. And then I'll explain what is a genetic counselor, and then why would I need a genetic counselor? And then finally, if you need a genetic counselor, where would I find one? And then I'll just do a recap at the end and then take questions. So we're in the midst of this genomics revolution, and pretty much everywhere you turn in the media, if you watch any of these news shows, documentaries, read things on social media, there's so many things going on in genomics. It's just really exploding. Genetic testing, there's gene editing, there's all sorts of things going on, and it's changing by the week. It's just exploding in all different areas. Sequencing of the human genome has come down to less than $1,000 per whole genome sequencing. So we're really in the midst of a great revolution in genomics. I'll go in a little more detail. So in genetic testing, there's several areas that that the testing is primarily used. One of the big areas area that has made a lot of impact is in pediatrics. And so there's a lot of successes have been attributed to the fact that pediatricians will encounter a child, sometimes a newborn, that has some sort of syndrome, something is amiss, but they don't know exactly what it is. The standard tests, lab tests that they run don't come up with anything definitive. They're mystified of what the problem is. And so they do sequencing of the whole genome of the child. And then they find some sort of genetic abnormality. And then based upon that knowledge, they know what biochemical pathways involved. Then they have a much better idea of how to treat the child. A lot of successes in the area of pediatrics. And this is fairly new in the past 2 years. Oncology is another one where genomics is really revolutionizing how oncology is being practiced. So in brief, what oncologists do now much of the time is whenever you have a tumor, the tumor is genetically has a lot of mutations. There's a lot of genomic instability. It's much different from the cells that surround the tumor. And so what they do is they sequence the normal cells, and they find out what the baseline is of what the genes of interest, what the sequences are. They compare that to sequencing of the tumor genes, and they find out what the mutations are. And then based upon that, they also can figure out the biochemical pathways, and that allows the oncologists to use most of the time existing drugs to block those pathways. And it's targeted cancer therapy. It's much different from the traditional surgery, radiation, and cytotoxic chemotherapy, which is what it sounds like, cytotoxic. It's broad spectrum. Any cell that is fast growing, it kills, which is why it has such devastating side effects. Now with these targeted therapies, they have huge promise in helping with treating cancer. And that's based upon genomic sequencing of the patient's normal cells and tumors. There's also disease risk. So if someone has a family history, a genetic counselor will do a pedigree analysis and see if there's a family history of certain diseases. A lot of times they're cancer syndromes. So breast cancer runs in the family. Based upon what the pedigree analysis says, then that might indicate doing some sort of gene panel sequencing for genes that are known to be involved with cancer. The two genes that get most of the attention in the media are BRCA1 and BRCA2. They're two separate genes, but they're involved with primarily in women, breast and ovarian cancer, but they also affect cancer risk in men as well. And so this is revolutionizing preemptively looking at cancer predisposition. And this is all based on these new technologies that have come up in the last 10 to 20 years. So at the bottom of the screen is a benchtop sequencer. So you can actually sequence part of the human genome using a benchtop sequencer in a clinical lab that is about the size of a microwave oven. So it's revolution. It'd be something that could be in any clinical lab. So it's really revolutionizing the practice of medicine in these terms. We also know if you go to a pharmacy or you watch television or anywhere, there's a lot of ads for these direct-to-consumer genetic testing kits. So they do a lot of different things. The most well-known is 23andMe. I think pretty much everyone's heard of 23andMe. They do disease risk testing and ancestry testing. Then there's many companies that do specifically ancestry testing. Some do some sort of tests for cancer predisposition. They look for mutations or mutations in cells that are showing signs of being precancerous. And then this genetic testing is it's even being done by the large laboratory testing companies. So both on the clinical side, but especially on the direct-to-consumer side, there's a lot of genetic testing going on that are initiated by patients or by clients, by consumers. So on the direct-to-consumer testing, the big ones are, big areas are disease risk. So that's what 23andMe primarily does, is what is your predisposition risk for certain diseases. There's pharmacogenomics, which is a whole area in and of itself, but the idea is that as genetics affects so many of our traits, and so eye color, hair color, so many things about us are specifically related to our genetics, so is our personal physiologies. So how we metabolize and process and react to drugs is also dependent upon our genetics. And so there are companies that are springing up, there's a lot of them already, that will test specifically genes that are involved with drug metabolism and drug response. Similarly, there are companies that are springing up to look at genetic predisposition for how people react to different nutrients in foods. And so that's an area that's growing. And of course, as mentioned before, ancestry testing. It's huge, there's a lot. And we'll have a webinar in the series specifically about ancestry testing. It's very interesting what the limitations are, how they do it. And so I hope you, the audience joins that webinar. I think you'll really be illuminated by that. But this direct-to-consumer testing is really done. You buy a kit, or you get a kit sent to you in the mail. You do a buccal swab, or you collect saliva. You send it off, send your email, get a code, and there's not necessarily any physician involved. In fact, a lot of times there isn't a physician involved or a clinical geneticist. So this is directly between the consumer and the company performing the testing. Another thing that is huge is in vitro fertilization, which people that are well versed in assisted reproductive technologies are aware of. So taking an embryo and then fertilizing it outside the womb and then re-implanting it. But a big part of this, much of the time, there's pre-implantation genetic screening. And so from the blastocyst or sometimes surrounding tissue, what the physician will do is they want to see if there's any kind of genetic abnormality before they implant the embryo. And so two major categories of what they're looking for. One is aneuploidies, and aneuploidy means an extra or missing chromosome. So trisomy 21, which is also known as Down syndrome, is the presence of a third copy of chromosome 21. There are really 5 aneuploidies where they result in live births, and the children typically grow up to become adults. A lot of aneuploidies are fatal in the womb. They result in miscarriages. Sometimes women get pregnant and will have an aneuploidy and they won't even be aware of it. And so the idea is that you want to do genetic screening, or a lot of people choose to do that, to see if there's an aneuploidy that would be fatal. And so there'd be no point in in implanting that embryo. Of course, there are a lot of ethical issues involved. There's a lot of discussion and controversy involved in doing that. The other thing that they look for is certain specific genetic abnormalities. So things like Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, Fragile X syndrome. There's certain, especially if there's a family history of some of these diseases, they want to look and see if the cell that they take from the blastocyst, that little embryo, to see if they have that genetic abnormality. Again, controversial in a lot of ways, but there are places that are doing that. And we also have this astounding new technology called CRISPR-Cas, discovered by Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, both of whom won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020 for this amazing technology where it's very precise. You can go in, take this molecular machinery into the cell where you can precisely find a place in the genome, and you can either take out the gene or replace the gene. If it's abnormal, you can knock it out so it doesn't have any function. There are a lot of things you can do, and the technology is just getting better and better and better. And so it's being used in many, many different ways. And so this is something that's relatively new, and it's really exploding in the genomics technology area. Is an example of how you can use these genetic gene therapies for inherited disorders. So this is going to be another webinar where I'll go into more detail, but for the first time, we now have a treatment and actually a cure for sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is really a monogenetic disorder. There's a point mutation in a specific gene. Now, what they can do, because this is related to red blood cells, is they'll take some bone marrow, take the progenitor cells for red blood cells, take them out, use CRISPR to correct that defect, put in a normal version of that gene, then reimplant that into the patient's bone marrow. So now they start producing normal red blood cells, and that they've gone through preliminary trials. Now this therapy is in actual clinical trials, which it's not perfect, but it shows a lot of promise, and there have been great successes in actually curing people, maybe not 100% normal cells, but enough that it relieves their terrible symptoms. So, I mean, this is just really astonishing new technology. Same with a lot of disorders. Beta thalassemia is another one. In fact, there is a long list of inherited diseases that are being cured essentially through using these gene therapies. Kind of the same idea where you take cells out of bone marrow, you correct the genetic defect, put those cells back into the bone marrow, and now the body starts producing normal cells. So this has tremendous possibilities for treating diseases that are previously intractable. So this is really, really exciting stuff. And also there's embryonic genetic engineering. So using these same CRISPR tools, researchers can now actually engineer an embryo. And this is very controversial. It's illegal in a lot of countries. The United States it's a little bit of a gray area. It's not really illegal to do it. There's some restrictions on it, but again, there's people on both sides of the issue, there's a lot of bioethical concerns associated with it. One is that they don't want people, especially people that have the financial means to pay for this, to have so-called designer babies. So they want their child to be an athlete or whatever, and they seek out specific genes that they want altered in the embryo. Very controversial. There's a lot of, again, a lot of ethical issues that are related to that. However, the technology exists. The fact that most countries ban it doesn't mean that every country in the world will ban it. So this is something that's up and coming. A lot of ethical issues associated with it, and that I think people should be aware that this is coming. This is coming to prime time potentially, unless we have some sort of concerted effort to really restrict this and control it. So with this genomic revolution, we have massive amounts of genomics knowledge already accumulating, and it's just accumulating at an exponential rate. And this knowledge is extremely complex. I've given a high-level overview of some of these things, but they're highly technical, using highly technical language. And then when you have genetic testing, a lot of times there's a lot of uncertainty in the results. So you can come back with a result where you can't exactly say for certain how that's going to affect the patient's health or the health of the child. So rarely is there a yes or no answer. Sometimes there is, but a lot of genetic testing comes back with a probability and not a specific answer. And that's one of the issues with direct to consumer genetic testing for health issues. And as mentioned previously, in pretty much every of the slides that I've shown, there are complex ethical issues to be considered. And I'll bring up some more as well that aren't maybe not quite so obvious. But the people who are doing this are typically clinical geneticists. They're PhDs or MDs. They have to take a 2-year fellowship and then take a board exam and become a fellow of the American Board of Medical Genetics and Genomics. And on top of that, they usually have many years of experience. So they're very, very focused in narrow areas of knowledge domain. So that brings the problem. So we have the clinical geneticist with all of this education and all this technical knowledge, all this background, all of this ability, all of the technical terms. Then you have the patients, right, who aren't educated in these areas. So that there's the big gap. How do you get the clinical geneticist to communicate to the patients? A lot of scientists and a lot of physicians are good communicators, but still there's a risk of them talking over the heads of their patients, not being able to communicate the technologies, the risks, the pros and cons, the ethical issues, all of that, right? And so that's where the genetic counselor comes in. Genetic counselor is exactly what the name implies, a genetic counselor. They're counselors. They bridge the gap between the clinical geneticist and the patients. And so they serve as advisors to the patients and their families concerning genetic tests, risk factors, family history and health, everything that we've talked about previously. They are often educators, both formally. So some of them actually produce educational materials for patients. They give seminars. They do formal education for patients, but they also do informal education as well, in terms of actually meeting with the patients and explaining whatever the issue at hand is. So they help patients better understand things like test results or the pros and cons of doing some sort of genetic manipulation, so that the patients will have better informed decisions to what they want to do next. So they serve in a variety of roles. So one, there's just so many. There's prenatal and preconception counseling. So for parents who are deciding, they're thinking of having a child, and maybe they have some sort of family history of a disease, they talk to a genetic counselor. Genetic counselor will be able to walk them through that, what are the risks that my child might end up with this this condition. Same with pediatrics. So children who are already born and they might have some sort of inherited condition. Again, the genetic counselor serves as that go-between between the clinical geneticist and the patient. Same with cancer. So I explained how cancer is being used for helping to guide targeted treatment therapies for cancer. That's something that's not necessarily easily or quickly understood, but genetic counselors are the people who can explain that to the patients, so they have a better idea of what's going on, and they, again, make better informed decisions about whether they want to take a targeted therapy or not, how they want to combine that maybe with traditional therapies. Cardiovascular diseases, neurology, I mentioned assistive reproductive technologies, and also even psychiatry. So a lot of psychiatric conditions are linked to genetic mutations. And so that's, again, something that a genetic counselor can talk to patients about, or the patient's relatives about. Increasingly, genetic counselors are taking on more roles. So they're working in laboratories because they have this, well, we'll go through their education shortly, but they have so much knowledge, both on the technical side and working directly with patients, that they're really vital to a lot of genetic and genomic research. They're great educators. They're taught to be good communicators. They're involved with public health. They work in the nonprofit world and the corporate world. There's a lot of different areas. The direct-to-consumer testing companies are recognizing that they need more genetic counselors to talk to their clients about test results, because much of the time the client will receive these test results and they're overwhelming and they don't know how to think about it, how to interpret it. So that's where the genetic counselor comes in and can talk the client through the testing results and what they mean. Increasingly, genetic counselors are practicing through telemedicine. So there's a lot of job openings for telemedicine companies that are really looking for genetic counselors, because they can work remotely with patients fairly easily. There's also, in oncology, increasingly there are these panels of experts called tumor panels, and so they're principally composed of, you'll have an oncologist, a clinical geneticist, maybe a nurse practitioner, some sort of patient advocate, but also genetic counselors. Every tumor panel has a different composition of people, but what they do is they assemble a team together of experts from different areas, and they review different cases, and they recommend the best treatment options collectively. This is something that's very positive. It's really helping to improve the outcomes of cancer patients, but genetic counselors are an integral part of this as well. And also being called upon for public education, because there's so many misconceptions, so many things that circulate around on social media that are partially correct, but not completely correct, or actually false. Right? There's a lot of call for people who have the knowledge, who can talk to the layperson about these issues, in an informed way. And so there's so many different ways that genetic counselors are very, very valuable to medicine. So to become a genetic counselor, typically a student will come in with a bachelor's degree in either molecular genetics or something similar, something very heavy on the genetics or biochemistry side, or they come in with a degree in psychology. Then they earn a Master of Science degree in genetic counseling. And there's something like 48 different programs, I believe, in genetic counseling between the US and Canada. We share a lot of the same standards. And so these genetic counselors, once they graduate from their undergraduate degree, they go into a specific genetic counseling degree, and they're very intense and intensive. So they go year round for 2 years. They take a lot of different topics, very technical topics, molecular genetics, embryology, heritable diseases. They have to know pedigree analysis, but they also have to deal with the human factor, which is understanding bioethics, the principles of counseling. How do you counsel patients? How do you communicate with patients? Then they have to do a number of clinical rotations in different areas like oncology, pediatrics. There's a number of them that they have to do in a medical context under the supervision of a licensed genetic counselor. And then on top of that, they need to do a research capstone of some sort. So they're involved in research. That's a lot of activities, a lot of knowledge. It's a lot they have to go through, which makes them just so knowledgeable and have wonderful skills on the technical side and the people side, the human side, being able to connect with people and being empathetic with them and helping them understand ethical issues and any other sort of issues related to what is best for the patient and their families. So after they graduate from these very rigorous programs, then they have to pass a comprehensive board examination administered by the American Board of Genetic Counseling. So until they get that board credential, they're really not allowed to practice. And then in most states, and there's legislation in the other states in the United States requiring, on top of all of this, a state licensure as well. And so there's a lot they have to go through to be able to practice. So why would I need a genetic counselor? Well, like I said, genetic counselors are professionals who bridge the gap between genomic technologies and the patients. They're also great educators, like I said, and great communicators. They're empathetic, and they're advocates for their patients. So their whole profession is centered around educating the patient and helping them understand the best choices that are in their best interest or that of their family members. With all that education they get, they understand the technical details. So they understand essentially what the clinical geneticist, that technical knowledge, but they can translate that technical language into ways that the patients can better understand the issues. And they have a strict code of ethics and a respect for their clients. So genetic counselors really have a lot of responsibilities on their shoulders, but they have the background and the practice to be able to really excel in their professions. So why would I need a genetic counselor? Well, there's so many different contexts that we couldn't go through all of them. It can't be exhaustive in them, and it depends on if you're a health practitioner. There's so many different areas you might be involved with where you might want to order or order a genetic test, suspect there's some sort of genetic involvement, or at least you want to rule something out and you want to do a genetic test. Well, you can do that, but it's a good idea to actually have a genetic counselor work with the patient in addition to you as a health professional. So when doing any sort of clinical testing, definitely clinical genetic counselor should be involved. But also increasingly with direct-to-consumer testing, because of the problems that have arisen of clients being confused, or they'll learn something about their genetics that really worries them and concerns them, that you really need a genetic counselor to talk them through it and to explain really what the reality is of these of the test results. So they're highly qualified to answer both the patient and client technical questions, as well as guiding the patients through the ethical considerations, which are numerous, and a lot of them, a lot of surprising ethical considerations come up. So here are some example scenarios. So a client takes a direct-to-consumer genetic test, and the results state that the client has a 20% increased risk of breast cancer. The client is worried and is considering a preventative mastectomy, right? Double mastectomy. So, a few years ago, Angelina Jolie made the national news because of that sort of scenario. But is a 20% increased risk of breast cancer meaningful? That's where you need an expert to come in and kind of explain, what does this really mean? And should you opt for something as a radical medical procedure or not? And in fact, one of the standard practices is you never make a clinical decision based upon a direct consumer genetic test by itself. So you always need, when you get results that seem to have some sort of clinical ramifications, you always need to have them verified by a licensed clinical laboratory, because direct consumer testing is not as rigorous as a laboratory that's specifically devoted to doing clinical genetic testing. So that's something that a patient probably doesn't know on their own, and that's something that a genetic counselor would have to inform them about. Another scenario is ancestry tests have been seen as really sort of recreational, right? So it's kind of fun to see who your ancestors might be, or find a long lost relative through taking a direct consumer test. Well, after people have been doing this for a while, there have been a lot of ethical issues that have come up. So there's a percentage of the time that the results actually reveal non-paternity, which results in a lot of family stress a lot of times. There's a lot of surprises that come in. So it's a big issue now. Should people who take ancestry DNA tests, should they have gotten an informed consent from their relatives before doing it? And in fact, the tests are more accurate when multiple members of a family take the same test. And again, I'll go into that in more detail in a later webinar, but that's really, really interesting. But there's a lot of ramifications. In some cultures, ancestry is very important. And so if a person finds out from a direct-to-consumer ancestry test that they don't have the ancestral history they thought they did, then that can pose problems for them in a lot of different ways. Another thing that people aren't aware of is there are a lot of limitations to ancestry direct-to-consumer testing, because every time there's a generation passes, the subsequent generation loses some of the previous generation's DNA. And so if you think that you're getting a comprehensive answer about your ancestry by taking one of these tests, as you go further and further back in generations, it becomes less and less accurate, and you miss a lot of potential ancestors. That DNA is gone, right? So, so you could have ancestors from particular ethnicities that would never show up on a test. And so that's something that the average person would not know. And that's what, again, a role for a genetic counselor to explain all of these complex issues that have real ramifications for the client, and a lot of ethical issues for the client's relatives as well. Another scenario, a couple decides to have a baby, and both prospective parents have family history of early onset Alzheimer's. And there's a number of genes that are associated with that. And so should the couple get a genetic test for mutations in those genes that are linked to, thought to be responsible for early onset Alzheimer's? So again, you'd want to know what the odds are, right? That the baby inherits this predisposition. Should both parents get the test? If they do and they come up positive for this mutation, what are the ramifications? Should they have a baby or not? And so these are questions that an outsider can't answer. This has to be done by the parents, but under the guidance of someone who's knowledgeable about the technologies, the ethical issues, what other families do, what kind of support systems are in place, just all of these other issues that the patient by themselves would not normally have access to. So then the question is, if you want a genetic counselor, where do you find one? Well, the easy answer is in the United States, there's the National Society of Genetic Counselors, which is all genetic counselors the membership is all genetic counselors, and they list themselves if they're available in a registry. And so as you see on the right lower corner of the slide, find a genetic counselor. And so they have a search engine where you can find different states, different specialties where you can find a genetic counselor. And so I think we have the link that could be pasted into the chat if you're interested in looking at their website and looking all about genetic counselors. And for a lot of health professionals, might be worth bookmarking that site in case you think that you might need the services of a genetic counselor in the future. So that's an easy answer. There's one stop shopping for genetic counselors, and plus they're very knowledgeable as an organization. And so if you're outside the US or you have specific needs or any question that you have about genetic counselors, they're very open to helping clinicians find the right people or get the right support for what they're interested in doing. So and just to round this out at the end, before we go to question and answers, I mentioned earlier, and that was introduced as the program director of the Master of Science in Human Genetics and Genomics at Southern Colorado University of Health Sciences. So this is launching this fall. It's 100% online. So no matter where you are, you can obtain your degree. You don't have to attend classes on campus. It's asynchronous, which means that there are weekly assignments due or certain days, but you can do all of your coursework on your own hours, your off time. So it's perfect for people who have professions, have jobs, day jobs. You can work on evenings and weekends. And you can finish this a complete Master of Science in 3 terms, which is 1 year full-time, which is taking 2 courses at a time, or you could do it 1 course at a time in 2 years, 24 months. And you can enter either in fall, spring, or summer. So there's 3 different entry points. And we cover traditional genetics, but also the latest discoveries and technologies and topics in human genetics and genomics. And so I think that link would be pasted in the chat as well. So I think we're about really on time here, and I'll stop my share. And I think there's another slide that will be going up here.
Dr. Handley, what a great presentation.
Thank you.
I really learned a lot. I think this is just so valuable for our integrative health clinical community, because I know a lot of clinicians that I know, are struggling with how, folks will bring in their ancestry test or, whatever those direct consumer tests are, really wanting answers. And this really helped to highlight the real need for the integrative health community to partner with and work closely with genetic counselors, because it is a very robust area with lots of questions and a lot of education as well.
So if you'd like, I'll answer any questions.
Yeah. So there's a question from Erica Cords-McCabe. She asks, is there already a genetic treatment for breast cancer?
Not specifically a genetic treatment. There are treatments that are based upon, again, sequencing a tumor and then finding out, discerning what the mutations are in the tumor, or what genes are mutated that are driving the growth of the tumor. And then that can point to what kind of targeted drug therapy can be used. So we're not talking about the toxic chemotherapy. What we're talking about is specific drugs. A lot of times they're antibodies, monoclonal antibodies that bind to whatever growth factor is promoting the growth of the tumor. And so that's the value of that right now. Now in the future, there's a lot of promise for actual genetic therapies for breast cancer. But this is especially useful for triple negative breast cancers, which still continue to be a real challenge for oncologists. But now having these targeted therapies, and there's dozens of drugs that are already FDA approved that could be used in these contexts.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question coming in from Sue Hannibal. She asks, can you comment on what appears to be an inherent conflict between pharmacogenomic discoveries and the dangers of psychotropic meds that carry black box warnings of addiction, suicidal ideation, and antidepressants, sudden cardiac death, and antipsychotics, etc. This translates to a chemical time bomb in a person with an undiagnosed genetic metabolism abnormality.
So yes, these issues are well known, and that's one of the objectives of pharmacogenomics is to use genetics to help predict the likelihood of these side effects happening. And so there are cases where, based upon a person's genetics, it can guide their treatment in the ways that maybe a person would not respond to an SSRI, but they might respond better to a different class of drugs. And to get a little bit deeper into the weeds, we're also talking about metabolism rate. So there's enzymes responsible for metabolizing and excreting drugs. And so those have genetic variability. Some people are very fast metabolizers. Some people are slow metabolizers. So the fast metabolizers can take a drug and it'll be excreted out of their system. It may not get any effect, but the slow metabolizers may not clear the drug quickly enough. And in those cases, they actually start having toxic side effects. Now that's aside from the pharmacodynamic side, where you're looking at things like receptors. What is the drug targeting? So is it a GABA receptor? Is it a dopamine receptor? What sort of receptors or intermediate molecules? What's in the biochemical pathway that the drug is affecting? And so you're looking at the genetics of that. So if you have a mutation in a receptor that the drug is an agonist for, then the drug may not have any effect at all. And so that's kind of an overview, but then once you get more knowledge about the biochemical pathways involved with these pharmaceuticals, and then the genetic components of that gives the clinician and the patient more knowledge about which medications have the lower chance of side effects, and medications that, based upon genetics, should definitely be avoided. And this is something of great importance. And I mean, we're really trying to get pharmacogenomics into the prime time. There's a lot of pushback on it. It's difficult to get clinical trials done. I've actually worked in this area. I'm part of the pharmacogenomics global network of researchers. So we're kind of facing an uphill battle with trying to get research done. But this shows tremendous promise for helping to alleviate these side effects, because it's well known, and now we have one great tool to help prevent those side effects.
Great. We have another question coming in from David Okopniak. I hope I pronounced that right. He asks, when a counselor is advising on the probability of a certain outcome, do they take into consideration phenotypic plasticity? Do you know?
Well, that's on a case by case basis, but the counselors are educated well enough that they would be aware of those sorts of issues.
Great. And I have a question. I'm just along the lines of, obviously we know that the areas like oncology and pediatrics have just huge genetic work around those specific areas. Are you aware of any work being done in more of the integrative health type of approaches around, like you said, choosing a drug over another drug versus like maybe foods, looking at what foods could be helpful for people, or, more of that holistic, those holistic areas?
Yeah, I mentioned nutrigenomics. So yeah, the effect of genetics on your processing of nutrients. And so one is MTHFR, involved with folate metabolism. It's an example. The area is really kind of in its infancy. There's not a whole lot of data, but it's a growing, there's a lot of interest in it. It's a growing area, and I would expect that in the next 5 years, we're going to have a lot more information that will be able to give people really solid guidance as for their nutritional needs based upon their personal genetics.
Wonderful. Well, I just really want to thank you so much. We only have a few minutes left, and this has just been such a wonderful presentation. Very excited about the other two that will be coming up, and all the work that you all are doing at SCU. So
Right.
for those of you who are interested in learning more about genetics, our next presentation of the three-part series will be on July 23rd at the same time. And the topic is genetic ancestry testing, misconceptions and ethical dilemmas. So this will really be another great presentation. And then the third part of the series will be in November of this year, November 5th. And that topic is astounding successes using gene therapies. So if you'd like this presentation, please join us again in July and in November. And Dr. Handley, thank you so much for coming today and for being a part of this community.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be involved. So thank you.
So I'd like to take a moment to invite you all to a very important conversation that we'll be having called Crucial Conversations, Racism and Healthcare in the Asian American, Pacific Islander, and South Asian Communities. The AIHM Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Committee invites you all to this crucial conversation. And we're very excited to have three really incredible panelists: Li-Ming Tseng, who is an acupuncturist from NCCAOM, Sally DeCastro, who is a physician's assistant, and Rashmi Muller, who is an integrative physician at UCLA and with the VA. So we really welcome all people to join us. This is a series that we've been holding since last year around crucial conversations, and we're really looking forward to this event. It is this coming Tuesday, June 29th at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, and registration is free. So we ask for all of you to join us. And lastly, please connect with us at the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine. If you enjoyed this webinar, consider becoming a member of our organization, joining a local chapter, and you can find us on all of the social media channels. All of our webinars are live streamed to Facebook, and you can also find the recordings on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AIHM Global. So if you want to share this recording, or if you weren't able to join today but wanted to watch it, feel free to like our YouTube channel, and you'll get all of our new postings, and you can go back and watch Dr. Dan Handley's talk that we had today. So thank you all, and have a wonderful holiday, and we hope to see you next week at the forum.